So with membership, you get a ton of content. So not only is there reference documentation and directories, RFPs and RFQs, we also have a lot to offer individuals within bios, firm listings, and discounts on award submissions. So please do join SEGD. It's an incredible opportunity to grow. We also have a lot of upcoming events come soon. So next week on the 29th and the 30th, we have the Branded Environments Conference. And then of course, in November, we're holding our in-person conference in Philadelphia. So both of those are upcoming and they feature a ton of great content. We highly encourage you guys to gather up and go. A couple top level features for the presentation. All microphones will be muted. Enter any questions into the chat window. Tristan, one of my fellow co-chairs, will be there to answer them after the presentation. So without further ado, we have a great event planned today. It's called Designing for Success. And what that really means to us is that we've gathered 4 individuals who are known for their leadership. They're going to share their strategies, tips, and tips and tricks for designing large-scale projects and implementing them in multiple phases. So without further ado, I want to introduce our moderator for the evening, Trish.
Hi, everybody. Trisha Tomanelli, president and founder of T-Square Design with over 20 years of professional design experience working on projects from concept to completion. We run a multidisciplinary design studio, and I'm proud to say I'm a design offspring of one of the SEGD founders. So those founding members are really the critical piece of this organization. So I'm really proud to be part of this panel discussion today. Thank you.
Craig?
Hey, I'm Craig Berger. I'm chair of the CV Pathways program at Fashion Institute of Technology. That's a program with 700 students, or it's a department actually with 700 students with a large lower division communication design area. And we make up packaging, advertising and digital design, spatial experience design, which of course I teach in, and graphic design.
And Paul?
Hello, everybody. Paul Dudley. I'm president of ID Sign Systems. We're an architectural sign manufacturer based here in Rochester, New York, working on local, regional and national sign programs. Product designer by background, and we've had ID Sign Systems now since 2015. I've worked and continue to work in the US, Europe, and Asia. So we have a broad reach.
And last but not least, Kevin.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, hi, my name is Kevin Rourke. I work for Davis Marketing Associates. I've actually been involved in materials specification. I've got a hybrid role, so covering pretty much the US and Canada, calling on fabrication, distribution, design, architectural, and really just trying to educate the design community and fabrication community about new materials. I was in lighting for 17 years, neon fluorescence, 7 years in vinyl, and now working with glass plate, acrylic, Sloan LED, and a couple other manufacturers. So we really appreciate the invite.
And we really appreciate your time. So without further ado, Trish, I want to pass the mic off to you, so to speak, and dive into our first topic.
Great. So really an engaging opportunity here to get everybody on board, and we really storylined it pretty nicely. Our first topic is considering storytelling in brand guidelines. So storytelling is starting to be seen a little bit more and more in design packages. So we really want to start to discuss, and Craig can be the initiator here, as to what would be some best practices that you can share with the group in regards to storytelling and how that relates to brand guidelines and in design packages.
So I'll just get it started by talking about, I'm sure it's of no surprise to most of the people here that most of your work, when it goes out there, is not just seen by 5 or 6 people. Sometimes it's seen by 50 or 60. And when it comes to brand guidelines, it could be seen by 5,000 or 6,000, or in some cases, 5 or 6 million people. And so the designers who are getting ahead today, or most famous designers and the ones who are really excelling, tend to be the strongest at storytelling. And I just want to give just a couple of examples really quickly. The first one being, if you want to just flip quickly to the Syracuse one to start. I know you're from, I'm making you guys flip pretty quickly, but without some visuals, we'll show you. Okay, well, I'll start talking about it while you find it. But here it is. Yeah. So Syracuse University is a really great example of what we're seeing in excelling. This was done by Pentagram. Now, I always say to my students, Pentagram is so well known, but people always ask a lot of questions, why is Pentagram considered so strong? Whenever they do things, they understand that it's going to go out into the public, particularly for guidelines. And when they do these guidelines, especially like in the case of Syracuse University, those guidelines get seen by millions of people. And so these Syracuse guidelines are a PDF that's just freely available to everybody, really easy to spot and everything. So anybody doing a project can clearly see that the structure and that approach. And so environmental, graphics, packaging, all those elements are tied to a central narrative, things like information graphics. So whenever you do a project, and IDS, I know worked with EDR on the Syracuse system, and starting with that story becomes such a powerful instigator that keeps everybody on the straight and narrow, and then it allows you to have these great discussions, with stakeholders to start, like what's the spirit of those guidelines? What's the spirit of that story? And I just think that this is the future we're expected today, that it's not just a matter of doing documentation and doing instructions. It's a matter of telling narratives that can be extended to groups that we don't know who they're going to impact down the road and inside of that larger issue.
That's a great point, Craig, because it's also very true. We're not just designing in a silo. These are being broadcast into an environment that can be utilized across all levels. Now we work with communication teams, marketing teams, as well as construction teams. So as stakeholders, donor opportunities. So having these packages have a little bit more script to it is really helpful as a dialogue. Kevin, do you want to share a little bit more insight, any examples that you've seen, or some additional comments to the packages now becoming a little bit more robust with some storytelling to it?
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think one of the difficulties these days, opposed to the past, is very difficult to really figure out who's actually making the decision, right? So in other words, if we take a look at this, a lot of the branding firms I've worked with, it starts out with a logo, right? And then of course they expand upon that. And it affects so many different components where, that particular logo or branding could be anything from food graphics to clothing to exterior signage, interior signage. And, there's just a lot of moving parts to that to try to basically make sure that everybody understands that you're having a consistent message, you're having a consistent color scheme, you're having a consistent logo throughout a program, whether it be large or small. So that's where a lot of times I've come in. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I really think that really is helpful to kind of get an understanding as to who is the audience. And like you said, it's changing in this time, and it really needs to be clear. That kind of brings us to our next topic in talking about the importance of clear communication. Now, communication, as we all know, is a critical component in any aspect of a project. And really here for design, we're looking at a clear path of communication to manage expectations, as well as include proper planning. So Paul, let's talk a little bit about some key tips on clear communication that you can share from a fabrication standpoint.
Sure. From our perspective, we try and would recommend that the design and design community reach out to the fabrication team, not necessarily the specified one, but even if you've got a really good relationship with a fabricator, we would recommend that you bring them into that conversation as you're developing a design concept very early, pre-bid, because there's a lot of latent talent in the fabrication community that can really add to the communication aspects of what you're doing as a design's developing. They go through multiple stages. We certainly like to work with designers early on, but also post-award when we're really starting to develop the actual products that are going to be manufactured and installed wherever the site may be. We have a constant communication chain through Google Docs, through planning documentation, various software options to make sure that everybody's clearly has access to our thoughts and any submittals we're making, samples we're reviewing. We're trying to communicate in 3D almost immediately these days in terms of translating what is delivered to us in a two-dimensional manner. We're moving it in 3D very quickly so that people can actually understand any implications of some of the design processes or design ideas they're putting out there. Going back to Craig's comment on Syracuse, the client was very surprised on some of their two-dimensional decisions when they became 3D. So it is really important that you move quickly and clearly in terms of a communication strategy.
Yeah, that's really important, Paul. You brought up some really good topics because definitely now in this environment, now we're passing, post-COVID, where the communication has now been more virtual, as we're even experiencing today, utilizing different platforms, scheduling platforms, Google Docs, Google Sheets, or other software that's out there is really an integral part of the process. And I think now is being maybe utilized more, but it's really, I think, important to kind of share with the teams scheduling and updated target dates. So Kevin, can you expand a little bit more on the importance of time planning and managing expectations?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I always emphasize if I'm speaking to anybody from branding, end user, designer, what I typically would talk about is not something that you're going to pull off the shelf at Home Depot, right? These materials, these projects are pretty much custom made, and with custom made equates to time, right? Where, everybody's under under a tight time frame, but expecting something that's going to be done in 6 months and expecting it to get done in 8 weeks, something a lot of times has got to give, right? And so it's very difficult obviously with Zoom, again, for what we do, we make standard, I represent companies that make standard products, and we also manufacture custom products. And when you say cut, you've got to expect there are certain lead times, right? If you're making a Pantone specific color, if there's something unique in a product, they have to build that into the time side. And again, with where we're at right now with Zoom, it's very difficult to do what I do because we're in a visual business, right? And like Paul said before, emphasizing the idea of getting to a fabrication company or fabrication shop to see and understand why it takes a certain amount of time for a specific process. So that's why I encourage folks to go visit fabrication.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And I think that leads us into the next segment here, where it's that relationship between designer, manufacturer, fabricator. And oftentimes that relationship is so important when developing design packages, especially when it comes to brand standards, utilizing the relationships and making sure you're understanding what you are specifying. So back to you, Paul, if you can provide some best ways of how the fabricator and fabrication methods can be included in the process as it relates to this relationship.
I would consider bringing in an experienced fabricator into the design process as part of your project team. I think in terms, it's often a design bid and then fabricate process. But I'm a great advocate for moving the design and fabricator relationship to the design side of the equation, because there's a number of benefits that you can actually achieve. I touched on the experience things, but if you actually value engineer the design process with an experienced fabricator during the design process, you're going to have a number of benefits. It's going to help Kevin in the time frame things, because you're basically going to design for buildability. B, you're actually going to have a product that's actually going to have a cost saving to your client, because it's actually going to be much tighter in terms of its ability to go straight out into whoever's the winning fabricator. And finally, I think the long-term buildings process that, again, was the one that's most at risk if a design stretch is too long, design process stretch too long, is going to be short, because the fabricator will have in their hands a set of drawings and documentation that they can move very quickly to go into submittals and prototypes with, that is much tighter to rather than a situation where you're actually trying to translate a series of drawings that sort of really you bid on, but you really have to start from scratch to rebid it or rebuild it. So
yeah,
I want to kind of add two areas that are hugely important to get in today's group to get a fabricator involved really early during the design phase. One is material management. Kevin will probably tell you this. There's a massive shortages of materials that are available, or big delays. And a lot of people don't realize until they bid these projects that they put these timelines on. But if you can't even get the materials or the right things to do it, you're not going to be able to get those projects started. Knowing that early, based on the time span of the project and what you need, is really helpful. And then the second area, and this is, I saw David Vandenen is on here. He knows this one well, because working together, is issues related to sizing. Just by changing something by an inch or two of a material could save you thousands of dollars, because of course the standard sizing of different materials and how those fit into different projects. Those little things bear huge dividends when you're really working through those project issues. And it's just, there's so many of those complications today that we have to really think about, that it's always really important to get those fresh set of eyes to really look at those.
Craig, if I can interject really quick too, because like you mentioned in regards to materials, a lot of people are, they're under the impression that there's set sizes of something, but, I can speak of, like, for one of the companies I work, Plascolite, we make run to size. That means 50% of what we manufacture is not just a 4x8 sheet. So basically, the advantage of that is you're getting better yield off materials on something like that, or you can get larger pieces where there's no seams. So that's the kind of dialogue you want up front. But like you said, the concept of just in time does not exist now. It really didn't exist pre-COVID, because we manufacture signs, right? Again, it's not off something you pull off the shelf, but now with the situation with materials, just in time, it's a very difficult concept to really comprehend right now. So
yeah, no, I think that these are really great points. And also to the fabrication and Paul's, from a design perspective, we really utilize relationships and lean on those fabricators, but oftentimes they're providing, a service as a complementary option for us as designers. It would be really more beneficial to see how to integrate them. We just have to be sensitive when they bid, design, build. Oftentimes it just goes to the fabricator on some of those jobs. And this is where it's really the relationship between the three combination together is really, really key. And Craig, one other point we wanted to ask, you can add to, can you talk a little bit about developing the long-term implementation without the loss of quality? I know you touched on a couple of those topics, but can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, I think that we go into that. When I started thinking about this presentation, I asked Kevin, it's like, where can I find really great experiential graphic designer guidelines for long term? And Kevin said, oh, well, really, there isn't a lot. I mean, he gave me a few names to work with, but this is one of the hardest issues to run into, is this long term implementation for the long term. And I think that the key thing is really inside of the guidelines, focus on management approaches. So, focus on a methodology that includes prototyping. I'll give an example of this is, I do educational consulting. And so I worked with Vitro recently, where it was the development of a guideline and specification process. And of course, in that specification process, what you want to lay out is, those steps. You have to prototype. You have to do a field observation. I think including management steps inside of the guideline and specification process and basically create a checklist of those steps. So you have to follow that checklist as part of that project. Unfortunately, we have to add another skill level to it being experiential graphic designers. And that is basically that we are management consultants as well. We have to give guidance about what processes other people are going to need to follow through in the future, because generally projects are going to have phases 2, 3, 5, 10. Things will change over time. There needs to be systematic ordering systems. There has to be an approach to vendors that makes sense, right? You need to be able to understand what vendors can do what, or who to connect with for different pieces. If you need something quickly versus something slowly, or that could take more time. Management structure is all important to long-term implementation guidelines. And the stronger ones, I want to give a shout out to one firm because I featured them in the Sign Media article with SIGNS. SIGNS is a Canadian company that really focuses on kind of implementation guidelines, design guidelines, focus on implementation. And I included an example of some of their work, but they go into things like they show examples of other visual examples of projects. They show examples of implementation in their guidelines of ongoing work. And I think you just need to be that comprehensive if you're really going to have people follow this work into the future, because if you don't, it's going to break down and start breaking down pretty quickly.
Yeah, the checklist, the management, that's such a key component. I really do believe that simplify the steps to the point where, you check it off, making sure that you hit those markers on the management side. So actually, this is a great lead into the next topic, which we are talking about client education. And we really need to focus on making sure the client is educated and understands the development of these guidelines. I think more and more, there's too many times where, we as designers develop a package, we feel that it is strong at the moment. But then when it does go out to bid or utilizing other avenues, there's suggestions that are provided and that the client isn't really clearly guided back, it will dilute the effort overall. So it happens to be back to you, Craig, but just to talk a little bit about best practices and suggestions and how we could provide the client to make sure we stay tight with those sign standards. I know it probably piggybacks a little bit of what we just talked about.
Well, this is I think I want to open up to some of the other speakers because it's a little bit of a controversial issue, because here's the thing. Whenever you do these guidelines, right, your presumption is that there's buy-in from stakeholders, right? But that's not been necessarily always the case, right? Sometimes you do these guidelines, and yet when you start doing projects, you'll have stakeholders that come in and they'll say, oh, I don't want to follow that approach that we're in my guidelines that we developed. We want to do something else. I think I would believe that you have to, before you start any project at all, you don't talk about your role. You start with a discussion of the already existing guidelines and the existing interpretive approaches. And you want the client to say, all right, this is something we support. This is something we're inside of. Or if they don't, why? And get those down really well going into it, because the client really has to understand the role that they've established when they establish those basic standards, that those are the standards that we want to follow, at least in spirit, for all subsequent projects. And if you're going to break that standard or break that approach, there has to be a clear rationale or reason, or if you're going to interpret it differently, why are you interpreting it? How are you interpreting it differently? So if Trisha, you could add to that, because I know that that you've worked a lot heavily in this area before. And, you know, I mean, and did you ever get the sense sometimes that clients don't always remember, or, you know, they just constantly need reminders of decisions that were once made, you know, along these paths?
Yes. Yes, definitely. And I do think different clients, certain teams are a little stronger with that muscle that they have learned over time to make sure that we follow those guidelines. And other teams, I mean, sometimes you have the opportunity to stay in the relationship with the client and keep working on those projects. But oftentimes when you're developing a standard, that goes into a pool where then when we develop projects, architectural teams then usually take that, or they have the other design teams referencing those standards. So there's times where the designer who has developed that relationship to develop those standards, are not necessarily part of that discussion. And that's where it's making sure that that client is educated enough while you're developing those standards as to what to look for. And I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to add a little bit more on the fabrication end, because sometimes this does happen, which I'm sure, you know, and it's open to suggestion too. This is where the relationship of design, manufacturer, and fabricator is so critical in developing this, because if you design a package that's not going to be up to date and needs to be updated, and then the fabricator comes in and makes these suggestions, you know, also keep in mind, these guidelines, they're a working document. There not should be one submission and then that's it. There always should be a developed version as the first, but then it should roll out as codes change, specifications, materials. So Paul, do you want to share a little bit on the fabrication end about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are two things I would like to just touch on. We're always looking at new technology, like consistently. We're working in a lot of new technologies. The LED market changing daily. We're looking at solar power options. So there's a lot of new ideas and new things being tested and as part of our research, and that can often add value to a design process. So we'd like to, you know, take that into the design conversation and have sort of a dialogue around that to see if it could be applied. But the other aspects that we've come up in considerable, quite often and quite recently, is I call it the gorilla in the design fabricator relationship, and that's the local authority. Time after time after time, we're coming up with major challenges where there's been absolutely no interface between the design program or the brand expectation and how it's going to work in its community. So that throws up some significant delays in process. I mean, even this week alone, we've been in 2 variance meetings where conceptual branding ideas are just not going to fly. And this is with a national petrol retailer. So expectations can get crushed by red tape. So I would say that you should definitely have to spend time on an understanding of the environments that these systems are going to be applied to, because you can manufacture, but if you're not allowed to manufacture, you're going to hit significant delay.
Right, and I think, sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
Really quick, I was going to say, it's not really my world, but one of the things I've found is townships, right, that have standards that are 7, 8 changes, and so therefore, and a lot of times I've seen people start.
Are we back? Okay. So I think this then can kind of roll into our next topic. Now, this is the tight and up-to-date specifications. Now, I know this was really a perfect category for Kevin to jump into. You know, tight specifications is really critical. And then, as you know, working within your studio, are you working with fabricators and keeping you informed with new products and technology? As Paul just mentioned, you know, all of these components are so important to kind of keep the process moving forward, but everything is always evolving and changing. So Kevin, how often should designers be engaged with material suppliers for samples, technical documentation, supply review, prototyping? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a strong proponent and do specifications back in about 90 and you know, the manufacturers to see, tried to act as a conduit to show the importance of material selection. And what I've found is there are a lot of specifications are wide open to interpretation. So a good example for LEDs, somebody would just say white. Well, they need to understand there's many different color temperatures that dramatically affect, you know, how a sign's going to look. You know, acrylic and polycarbonate, you know, there's not a white acrylic, or I've seen specifications that say milky white. There's no such thing as milky white. And so just trying to educate people about materials out there. And it's not just the materials that I have representative or do currently represent, but it's really the technology out there and how it impacts materials, right? So the idea of there's direct print acrylics and, you know, the idea of print technology and 3D printing, these are all things that are going to, you know, dramatically affect it. But the idea of having a tight specification so the brand is consistent through all fabricators, whether it's a regional application or a large, you know, a large rollout.
Yeah, that's great. And then as far as the prototyping, which you touched upon, is so important, and making sure even within the client's budget that they're aware, depending upon these different sign types that are designed, how does that look depending upon the environment that is going to be proposed? Because designing something on a screen is very different than how does that interpret in the field in that environment. And then Paul, how can we quality control from a specifications point of view in allowing for a little bit more tighter specifications? Is there some suggestions there?
I think the written specification in terms of the qualification of manufacturer is an underexplored role. So I think the design specification, if it's written around a group of pre-qualified manufacturers, rather than just throwing it to an open field and just hoping that the lowest bidder is going to come through, which I unfortunately very rarely happens. You know that the low bid has got to be compromising somewhere. So I think it's been an area where we felt in terms of when we're looking at bid opportunities, we kind of vet our fit to the project, and we are more likely to embark on a bidding process, which in itself is expensive for a manufacturer. If we think that the specification is written to allow a true representation of the design to be written into the specification, and therefore qualification of the potential manufacturers makes us much more comfortable that it's a job that we would like to get involved in. So I would definitely say that the sort of it's not just the product, but it's the team that you're going to be asking to bid the job should become part of that process.
Yeah, that's great.
I think you got to start thinking about doing independent bids for for basic types of projects. Yep. I think without independent bids, you're not really not sure. Come on in. Sure what you're getting, apples to apples.
So this is the light only for now, but you can take one.
I'm sorry.
I bought 8 of them.
So when it comes to independent bids, you are able to, you're really able to see exactly where you are. And so if somebody falls 20% or 15% below the independent bid, you could say why. Where are you switching out materials? Why are you doing what you're doing to switch those elements out? And then start asking those serious questions. Because I hate to say this, I've been seeing this more and more in like the last year or two, where there's just like there's somebody proposed 8 bids between 1 and 1.2 million, and then one for like $740,000, and then you know something.
Yeah, if I can interject, I mean a good example is what you're looking at right there with that Rite Aid. See, in other words, with that program. This was very large. This is 2,000 locations, but even if it was smaller, the idea that you're working with the client up front. So we work with JLL on this one. So we basically worked on the specification, showed different options, And then of course JLL worked with the client to say what works, and then you've got to police those specifications. That is most critical. This in particular had 6 sign companies, and the idea of taking it from a logo on a piece of paper and then translating it to illuminated signage, you know, then you have to police the specs. I mean, it's because I hate the term. I mean, we used it a little bit earlier, value engineering. I mean, I've heard some quote unquote sales pitches where a sign company will come in and say, let me take what you've got and let me just try to figure out how to value engineer it. But then to find out the client's not getting apples to apples. And that's what makes manufacturers of materials and fabricators crazy, because it's not a fair comparison. And then really you're bragging about the idea of having products that are out there 10 years, but if it's misused or substituted for something that's, you know, inferior, that's when it becomes a problem. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, to Craig's point, you know, we as a design studio, we encourage the, you know, bid leveling, and that meaning really reviewing each of the sign types, understanding how they compare to the other vendors, and then seeing what possibly could be off or shifted. And that could be a, you know, a key, or like a light goes off saying, hey, let's question this. As Kevin mentioned, you know, are they substituting out a specification? Why is this price point so much lower? What's happening? And you know, the challenge is a lot of these, you know, projects, if they're pushing it over to the GC land, you know, they're not always focusing on these real intricate details. They're looking at bottom lines, looking at let's push this project through. But really that this process is so critical. It just adds more headaches to us on the back end, which, you know, can be really challenging. So I think now we can kind of jump back into the our next topic of discussion would be a little bit of now design for buildability, and what does that look like? So Paul, can you share a little bit of how we can design for immediate buildability? I think this is a great discussion point we've been kind of touching upon, but just clarifying it a little bit from a fabrication standpoint.
We're definitely focusing a lot of our efforts on engaging with the designing community, so that they actually can turn to us as a regular resource in terms of how to develop a concept. So this is we're looking at a sign we actually developed, which is based around a sort of spatial experiential sign for a major university. And the architects and designers came to us on day one saying, this is our concept, and we really need your resources in terms of how this would be approached. And we actually became part of the design team. So we moved from the usual manufacturer's seat to the design extension, a sort of a engineering support to the designer's concept, and we worked with them, and then we bid the project. So we were actually paid to help with, as an engineering resource, but with the full knowledge that at some stage we would actually have to rebid our own work. But that was fine. We took that on happily. But we felt the contribution we were able to make in terms of exploring the detail and how the lighting would work, and how the negative space could be drawn into this solution came out, and the result was exceptional. But again, I think if you had that resource and that experience sitting at the end of your desk, and it's a very willing resource. I honestly, I'm not just speaking for myself when I say all the manufacturers I know work much better if they're brought in early. So the buildability of your sign will improve significantly if you have that dialogue with both the material supplier and the good engineering resource.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, Paul, because it really what we look sometimes where we have to try to kind of like change our focus is where we're looking at fabricators as an end product instead of teaming, where you gave a great point. We often use them to give them a quick call. Can you give us some tips on how to fabricate or some production methods of buildability? But here, where you got engaged, and oftentimes we don't have a budget allocated for an engineering fabrication piece of the project, separate from before you bid it. So here you were able to work closely on getting documentation developed. And I think that's a real great strategy and hopefully we can start educating the teams, you know, the broader teams, because a lot of these projects are really on the bigger scale, because you have the architects as the prime, and you kind of come in as part of the sub-consultants, you know, really educating the bigger team to say, like, this is a piece of our work that's really critical to make it look as you see it here. One of the pieces too, I think, Kevin, I want to address this to you. In the specifications, we have often seen approved or equal to, and sometimes what we do, not characterizing all of us as designers, but sometimes in the design world, you know, we have a direction that we want to specify, but we're trying to kind of give a possible alternative. But what, from your point of view, Kevin, what constitutes or equal to, and what steps can be taken to really validate that, or how should we look at incorporating or not incorporating that message?
Yeah, it's a great question, Trisha. So yeah, the term again, or equal to, well, what constitutes or equal to? And so all the manufacturers have documentation. So in other words, good example for LEDs, like Sloan and others, obviously they're tier 1 LEDs. So that means they meet certain criteria in regards to color, temperature, binning, durability. And if somebody says or equal to, well, if somebody's saying or equal to, then somebody should be able to pull up documentation that actually, you know, confirms that it is an equivalent. You know, typically if you see or equal to, I would typically, you know, I'd rather to say to be approved. So you have the opportunity to see something that's side by side. We have the same thing with the acrylic and polycarbonate. You know, there's light diffusing, there's non-light diffusing. And so or equal to, it's not or equal to, because there are certain properties of certain materials that the finished product may not look the same. So having documentation, and you can get it from all the manufacturers, if you're going to make a statement like that, you should absolutely be able to back it up, as should the fabricator go out of their way to basically reach out to folks like myself and other manufacturers out there that are willing to help. So
great. Yes, thank you. And then, you know, now I believe this kind of rolls into the next topic, which we have is the fabricator's role. And I know we have touched upon this in different topics previously to this conversation, but Craig, I think starting with you, what role should an experienced fabricator play with a design team and documentation prior to bid? What do you see would be appropriate?
I'd like to sound a little controversial about this because I've seen so much difficulties lately. I think by fabricators, I'll group fabricators and manufacturers together a little bit here and say that any designer today, if you're going to be successful for these large scale projects, has to have like a list of manufacturers and fabricators across a range of areas that they're going to know they're going to work with, knowing full well that they're not always going to be awarded the work. You know, I mean, this is one thing that designers, that always gets me, I don't say a little miffed with designers, is that they're always like, I'm afraid to call them because I don't know if they're going to get the work. Well, they know this. I mean, they live in the world. Okay, so and generally they will get the work the vast majority of the time if they're involved in the project. So they know that calculation. And the reality is you need to have any design firm doing these guideline projects on a large scale needs to have a concerted process already set up about how they're going to be bringing in manufacturers, bringing in fabricators. I'll go into another area I work with, because I work with Vitro, I also work with direct embed, with powder coated graphics. Well, the reality is that that powder coated graphics is great, but it's one graphic system. And you got to be able to know how to tap those different groups and get into a discussion about what's right for this project, how that manufactured piece works in. It has to be a concerted part of your process while you're working on it, because without that, it's always going to fall into this background role. Like if I look at I'm talking too much about this, but I always see Matthews paint, 3M vinyl. Now they're great. Okay, that's true. But the fact is that starts becoming a rote thing because we're not reaching out to different vendors or talking about what are the right specifications, what are the right approaches for these projects, and it's got to be part of the overall process.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Craig. And Paul, to kind of piggyback off of that, we wanted to look at from a Fabricator's role, how do you think we can further expand and implement these guidelines to stay true to the design intent?
I would honestly recommend through every design group at some stage in the development of the conceptual side to actually spend a day of that design period actually in a shop, and actually sitting down with the guys who are actually going to build it. You will shorten the process significantly if you literally hear. I mean, Kevin talked about material specs and sheet size and yields, but the cost savings are significant, and the return investment you're going to offer your client is significant, because you will get a better product for a less price, a lower price if you do that. The other thing that is rarely talked about but should be considered is serviceability. It never comes up in the design process that I get engaged in. Yet in reality, every sign that's built has to be serviced. So, think about that as terms of part of, the fabricator thinks about that, has to think about that. So, that's another area where you can actually save money down the line, because you can't get into a sign after you've built it. It's a problem.
Definitely, this is great. We have 2 more topics. We want to be sensitive to the time, so we want to roll into the next topic that we have is managing project scheduling. And here we really want to look at how to manage project scheduling with a clean and a clear line when you design, where the design is complete and production begins. Oftentimes, we've all probably have seen where the clients sometimes make reviews and comments in shop drawing phases, which possibly can pull us back to design changes that could just reduce the time for production. So Kevin, can you provide some good suggestions to help keeping the projects on schedule?
Yeah, and again, I think that kind of ties back to what we were saying earlier about communications, right? Because again, if you're calling out something that's, say, custom, you need to understand if you're going to want something custom, there's going to be an expanded length of time, have to discuss. I mean, it's more on Paul's world, but the idea of have to talk about surveys and permitting, right? Those are integral parts that are going to extend on a project. Scheduling also that I've found, and again, it's not so much my world, but even things up front from designers that, if you're on a tight timeline, there are simple things that you can make adjustments, like artwork. Something as basic as that is artwork, good artwork. I mean, when I was in the print world, the artwork, these companies spent more time cleaning up artwork, and it would delay projects, weeks on end because of that, or revisions, right? That's the other thing. So I think that certainly would help, speed up the process. But I truly, the management scheduling side on the materials side is absolutely communications, upfront communications, because therefore you're going to have to manage your client's expectations for this. So.
Great. And then Paul, how do we address this issue from a fabrication standpoint, not to compress production timelines so we don't get compromised, with either cost or quality, and making sure that the client is still happy with the end result?
I think a lot of this feeds back to client management. I think you have to be tough and frank with your client, because if you want the project that you've designed to come out and really how you want it designed, and therefore manufactured, you have to manage the client really aggressively, because it's so easy for the whim of the president of the company X to say, I want it done by a date. And full well that the design process has lagged behind. And if you just push to a situation where you're giving the manufacturing community virtually no chance, you will not. Nobody's going to be happy at the end of it. So the realism of that managing that schedule, it has to be real, and they have to be made accountable. That is, the owner, I believe, has to be made accountable that if change comes along and they change on a whim, there will be implications because, as Kevin said, a lot of material right now is sitting in a container in a ship sitting outside of a Long Beach. So, you just cannot magic solutions.
No, that's a really important topic, and continuing to kind of thread it through. This leads us to our last topic and slide in relation to public documentation, and kind of circles back to the very beginning conversation from the storytelling and the example that Craig provided, from Pentagram, where we are seeing now more and more public organizations, including colleges, larger brand corporate healthcare institutions that are posting online or having a portal where you can actually visualize and see these standards in place. So Craig, talk a little bit about how the impact of those guidelines have impacted the design and the approach there.
Well, I think the leader of this is probably Starbucks. They put their guidelines online, and anybody's freely able to look to see where they're trending, and then they talk about the trends and the changes in their guidelines. I think that's a direction that I think we're going to be seeing. I mean, I'm not 100% sure because it's just really starting out, but I think you're seeing a lot more of like the guidelines for the public documentation starts becoming not just about showing the design, but about raising a discussion about the trend and the direction they're moving into. I think that it allows a certain level of creativity and flexibility, especially if you're going into other locations. The idea of, there's some organizations like what Kevin talks about, like Rite Aid, where you have to have pretty tight standards. You have to. It's just the nature of the beast. But there are other organizations like colleges and other groups that do encourage a certain level of flexibility in their work, and certain corporations. So I definitely see this more kind of open-ended narrative-based approach for public documentation occurring. And what's good about that is it raises the education level of the client and the people being involved, because that's your biggest issue, is getting them to understand design sensibility when it comes to these type of projects, and what the design values and standards that this organization wants to hold to.
It's excellent. That's a great summary. And I think, Jess, we pretty much hit a lot of these talking points, and I don't know if the team has any, we have about 5 minutes left. If they have any questions through the chats that we wanted to share, or we can kind of expand on talking a little bit more about one of these topics.
Right. I actually want to answer Gary. I don't want to make any aspersions against 3M. They're a fantastic company, but I'm just bringing up the issue that sometimes there are specialty materials and things that, like, for example, a great one is there's reflective vinyl that we use for the DOT, right? That color reflective vinyl. That's a specialty material that's made by only a few companies. And those things, you kind of need to consult with people about those areas. That's what I was more getting into. I'm not going against the fact that especially for things like paint, vinyl, plastic, that there are go-tos for the most part, but I'm just also saying that we have to open our minds up a little bit to material approaches, different material approaches early on.
Thank you.
And those go-to companies are really strong as well. So I think that's why they are those go-to companies.
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Agree.
And I do find opportunities with some of the special materials to go away from some of the more standard traditional companies. But I just wanted to make sure that, just from routine, that if I have an understanding that's not true anymore, because I know initially it was like their warranty was so comprehensive, when you're working on a big job, you need to go with that material and not risk it with another company.
Well, I'll tell you where it's an issue is when it comes to new technologies, particularly, and being able to vet, like ADA, right? We've switched, we have photopolymer, we have etching, now we're getting into additive printing, right? So we have these new processes and materials. It's important, it's incumbent upon the designer and us to see where are we in these areas, right? Where are we in these technologies, and how do they best fit the project themselves, as opposed to just saying, all right, for every project from now on, we're gonna do photopolymer. And every project from now on, we're gonna do this. It's good just to know and be able to consult with people and saying, like, where are we with the state of these new technologies and their validity?
Well, I think also to work with companies who are well established too, right? In other words, in
Yeah.
the world of LEDs, I think everybody knows, I mean, like I said, I work for an LED manufacturer and I've seen 10 pop up and another 10 disappear, right? So if you're going to work with an LED manufacturer, make sure you're working, or any manufacturer, make sure they're well established, make sure they have history, make sure that they've got good customer service, right? People are going to be responsive. You know, everybody, you know, unfortunately, some of the products I sell are a commodity. And you have to show your value added. And the value added is exactly what you're saying about showing other materials. Because again, one of the things about fabrication I wish would change is the idea of getting away from complacency, right? There's not just 60 or white modules. There's not just a piece of white plastic. You know, the list goes on, and hopefully they can expand upon that, because what happens is people like me are going and educating the design community end users. I think it's in the best interest to a sign company, instead of going in with a sales pitch of let me value engineer something, how about saying, let me show you something new, right? There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's great. I encourage it.
Yeah, I think we really hit upon some real great topics. And I think the underlying message really is the team, you know, playing, you know, making sure we're in connection from understanding new technology, understanding what's updating code, and working very closely with the specification guidelines, from, you know, communicating with Kevin on a regular basis to understanding the right fabricators to work with, and then designing. I think also Craig brings a great contribution, you know, to the younger designers that come out of F.I.T or other schools that really need to understand the process. And, you know, have they been visited to a fabrication shop, and a lot of the newer, you know, technology, are they exposed to that? So I think this whole education process is really key, but it keeps evolving. So we really need to kind of keep up to date with everything.
Well, I would definitely say we definitely should fear for the younger generation, because they have less and less access to the physical world every year. And I think these conversations are very important, because I think younger people should, at a younger age, be introduced to physical material connectivity, resources, those type of things, because, you know, the farther you're detached from it, the tougher it is to visualize these things and incorporate them into your projects. And obviously it's a big part of our education at F.I.T, but I will tell you this, it is not easy. It is very, very difficult to teach.
Absolutely. So I agree with everything that's been said tonight. I think the one thing that makes tonight makes it really clear that not all of us can wear all of the hats. We're all a team that brings different strengths to the table, and it's really important that we're all communicating together. We do have a couple questions that we've gotten from the group, but I want to make sure that we're respectful of everyone's time. We can extend a little bit past, but we do want to thank everyone for joining the seminar today. It's been really informative. It will be recorded, so we'll post that to SEGD, and of course, if you want the recording, you can directly email me, jessica@entro.com. I'm always available. So the first question that we've gotten in the chat was in regards to storytelling. How are the panelists seeing the incorporation of new technology like VR and AR, and how are you dealing with that in guidelines, if at all?
I could probably answer this, because we're definitely enmeshed in this area. Overall, is that generally most guidelines will bring up to new technology as kind of like a line item, right? Like here's the new technology. You should start thinking about this. But you are starting to see a little more narrative brought into it lately. So, for example, if you're doing I'll give you an example. Like I did a survey for a healthcare organization, and they wanted to incorporate digital screens into different levels. So so you have to do it at the guideline level. You would start by saying, all right, here's a technology and direction that we look to go in, but then here's a series of best practices that support that direction, and really lay out those standards so you could build that into a design, and then give suggestions if you're going to do a design brief for those standards, what that design brief looks like. Because generally what the client will do is they'll take those guidelines, they'll turn it into a brief. And then that brief is going to go out to various vendors and various groups that they're going to be reaching out to. So the more ammunition you can give them to how to create that brief in the guidelines is really helpful in developing that narrative.
Thanks, Craig. We also have an additional question from Matt Reese. If you want to unmute yourself and expand on it.
Yeah, can you hear me, everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was kind of asking in that, in just sort of not only VR and stuff like that, but to in that storytelling process, are we seeing things like more video and more sort of engaging, either interactive or sort of more engaging than just still images and things in guidelines? Is that trending? And then also just sort of somewhat related is, to what degree do you guys feel, or how do you feel about providing control samples like paint chips and custom vinyl samples and things like that, and or is that kind of gone by the wayside?
Yeah, I mean, I could start and then maybe Paul can chime in too. Basically, really, the development of guidelines really is a focus on those that are static, right? So there's ADA components, there's building signage components, there's brand standards, but then, as you've mentioned, integrating what can be now a digital platform is definitely a section. So it's almost like creating the section. So definitely it is now being included, but I don't think ever static signage will be fully removed. But I do feel that we are kind of layering in new approaches and new technology, and is keeping us up to date. So it will become like an added chapter to an existing updated guidelines. So that's how we've been looking at it to implement. But Paul, if you want to share a little bit more too, and even about specifications and samples.
Sure. I mean, in the last 24 hours, we've had 3 requests for samples and an agreement to develop prototypes on a number of jobs. So I don't see that going away. In fact, in some respects, I think it's becoming more detailed and more exhaustive. With the complexity, certainly in lighting, and now we're working with lighting manufacturer on a major national project. And I would say it's probably the most detailed prototyping process I've ever been through. It's, every aspect of the light has been considered into, every issue, all the light values, the manufacturability of the system, the accessibility of the system have all been trialed and put through fairly exhaustive testing. So I actually think in the larger, more complex jobs, that aspect is actually becoming more rigorous.
And keep in mind also in regards to, on the materials side, in regards to samples, I mean, like Paul said, I mean, as a manufacturer's rep, the companies I represent, we're sending out samples every day, all day. And it's important because you need to physically see things, especially now with Zoom. Again, we're in a tangible business, right? Zooms are not going to be able to be nearly as effective as actually seeing physical samples. So, like I said, I would definitely encourage reaching out to your manufacturers for that, or your fabricator. And again, working with really strong manufacturers, again, one of the companies I work for is a large Sloan LED. You've got people that are available for light studies, information they're constantly always looking for. Instead of working, so just reach out to these people. That information is readily available, and I'll basically assist you. So.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that's all of the questions that we've received. Tristan, have we gotten any other?
No, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, all 4 of you, for your time. This has been an incredible conversation to listen in on. I've certainly learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. Remember that next week we have branded environments, the 28th and 29th. It's going to be chock full of incredible speakers just like today. So we're really excited about that, and I hope to see everyone there. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.